You don't get to block me from doing my job. We had a call for a welfare check.
I did not call anyone. I did not ask for anyone. You walked into my house.
The neighbor said they were concerned. I'm here to make sure you're okay.
I'm fine, and you do not enter someone's home without a warrant.
I don't need a warrant for a welfare check.
You do. If there is no emergency and no consent, you...
On a bright February afternoon in 2014, a white police sergeant forced his way into a private residence in upstate New York without a warrant, without probable cause, and without permission. The homeowner was black. The sergeant assumed he didn't belong there. What the sergeant didn't know would destroy his career, expose the department's culture of racial profiling, and ignite a national conversation about who gets to feel safe in their own home. Because the man whose door he broke down wasn't a suspect, he was a judge. Not just any judge, a New York State Supreme Court justice. Before we continue, what city are you watching from? If this is your first time listening, support the channel by liking and subscribing. Stories like this need to be told, and with your help, we can make sure these events don't go unheard. This is the story of how one sergeant's assumption became a lawsuit, a settlement, and a permanent stain on the badge he wore for over 2 decades. Justice Philip Ramos didn't look like what America imagines when they think of the word judge. He was Dominican American, born in the Washington Heights neighborhood of Manhattan in 1958, raised in a community where police presence meant tension, not protection. His parents were immigrants who worked double shifts so their son could attend college. Ramos graduated from SUNY Albany, then Albany Law School, climbing every rung with precision and discipline. By 2014, he had been on the bench for over a decade. He presided over felony cases, murder trials, high-stakes civil litigation. He wore the black robe. He wielded the gavel. He had the authority to send people to prison or set them free. But none of that mattered when Sergeant John Doe, name later redacted in court filings but confirmed through depositions, saw him standing in the doorway of a home in a predominantly white neighborhood. Because in that moment, Ramos wasn't a judge. He was just another black man who didn't belong. Ramos had purchased the home months earlier. It was a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburb outside Rochester. Nothing extravagant. No ostentatious displays of wealth. Just a place where he could retreat after long days in the courtroom. A place where he could feel like a citizen, not a symbol. He'd furnished it carefully. Hung family photos, installed bookshelves lined with legal texts and novels. It was his sanctuary. And on the afternoon of February 19th, 2014, that sanctuary was invaded. The call came in at 2:17 p.m. A neighbor whose identity was never publicly disclosed phoned the local police department to report suspicious activity at Ramos's address. The details were vague. The caller claimed they saw someone going in and out of the house and weren't sure if the person lived there. Read that again. Someone going in and out of a house. In broad daylight, that was the suspicious activity. No broken windows, no screaming, no signs of distress, just a black man entering and exiting his own home while the sun was still high in the sky. The dispatcher labeled it a welfare check. Sergeant John Doe responded. He arrived at 2:34 p.m., pulling his patrol car into the driveway with lights off. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the lawn. Children's voices echoed from a nearby yard. It was the kind of peaceful suburban tableau that appears in real estate brochures. He approached the front door, knocked twice. Heavy, authoritative knocks that cut through the quiet afternoon air. Ramos was in his study, enjoying a rare day off from the bench. He'd been reading through case law, a cup of coffee cooling on his desk. He heard the knocking and frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He descended the stairs, walked through the sunlit hallway, and opened the door. Standing there in full uniform was Sergeant Doe, hand resting casually on his duty belt, eyes already scanning past Ramos into the interior of the home. The afternoon light glinted off his badge. "Can I help you?" Ramos asked. "We got a call about this residence," Doe replied, his tone flat, transactional. "I need to come in and make sure everything's okay." Ramos blinked. "A call about what?" "Just need to check things out. Step aside, please." Ramos didn't step aside because he knew the law. Ramos had spent 15 years interpreting constitutional law. He had ruled on dozens of Fourth Amendment cases. He knew with absolute certainty that a welfare check did not grant an officer the right to enter a private residence without consent, exigent circumstances, or a warrant. "Officer," Ramos said calmly, his voice measured, professional, "I appreciate your concern, but there's no emergency here. I'm fine. This is my home." Doe's expression didn't change. "Sir, I need to verify that. I need to come inside." "No, you don't," Ramos replied. "You have no legal basis to enter without my permission." That's when the air shifted. Doe took a half step forward, his boot crossing the threshold. His voice hardened. The pleasant afternoon suddenly felt heavy with tension. "I'm conducting a welfare check. You can either let me in or I'll have to assume there's a problem." Ramos felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, from disbelief. He was standing in his own doorway, in the middle of a sunny afternoon, being threatened by a public servant who was supposed to protect him. "I'm a New York State Supreme Court Justice," Ramos said, his voice sharpening. "I'm telling you that you do not have the legal authority to enter my home. I am not consenting. If you proceed, you will be violating my constitutional rights." Doe stared at him. The afternoon sun illuminated the scene in perfect clarity, every detail visible, nothing hidden in shadow. And then Doe smirked. "Sure you are," he said, and he pushed past him. Ramos stepped back instinctively as Doe's shoulder brushed against him, the officer's body language radiating dominance. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the foyer in natural light. There was no darkness to hide in, no ambiguity about what was happening. This was a violation in broad daylight. "I said you do not have permission to be in here," Ramos repeated, his voice rising now, not with panic, but with controlled fury. Doe ignored him. He walked further inside, peering into the living room. His hand remained on his belt, fingers brushing the top of his holster. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder of who had the power in this moment. "I'm just making sure there's no one else here," Doe said casually, as if he were doing Ramos a favor. "There's no one else here because this is my home and I live alone," Ramos said, following him. "You are trespassing." Doe turned to face him, and for the first time there was something resembling annoyance in his expression. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm doing my job. If you've got nothing to hide, this'll be over in 2 minutes. If you've got nothing to hide." The phrase hung in the air like poison. It's the sentence every marginalized person has heard before their rights are trampled. The justification for every illegal search, every unwarranted detention, every abuse of power dressed up as procedure. Ramos didn't flinch. "I want your name and badge number, now." Doe's jaw tightened. He reached for his radio, keying the mic clipped to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Doe. I'm at the welfare check location. Homeowner is being uncooperative, requesting backup." Uncooperative. That was the word he chose. Not informed, not asserting his rights. Uncooperative. Within 4 minutes, 2 additional patrol cars arrived, their sirens breaking the peaceful afternoon silence. The flashing red and blue lights looked almost surreal against the bright February sky. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, standing on porches, shading their eyes from the sun as they watched. This was a neighborhood where police presence was rare, where crime was almost non-existent. And now there were 3 patrol cars parked in front of Justice Philip Ramos's home in the middle of a weekday afternoon. Officers, Hernandez and Mitchell, entered the house behind Doe, their hands also resting on their belts, their faces stone. The afternoon light streaming through the windows illuminated every detail. There was nowhere to hide, no room for misinterpretation. Ramos stood in his own living room, surrounded by 3 armed officers who had no legal justification to be there. "Gentlemen," Ramos said, his voice icily calm, "you are all witnesses to a Fourth Amendment violation. I have identified myself as a sitting judge. I have repeatedly denied consent for entry. You are unlawfully in my home." Officer Hernandez glanced at Doe. "Sarge, what's the situation?" "Welfare check," Doe replied tersely. "Neighbor called it in. Guy's being difficult." Guy, not Justice, not Sir, Guy. Ramos reached into his pocket. All 3 officers tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. The afternoon sunlight caught the movement, every gesture visible, every threat implied. Ramos froze, his hand still in his pocket, his eyes locked on Doe. "I'm reaching for my identification," he said slowly. "Do not escalate this." He withdrew his wallet carefully, opened it, and held up his judicial credential, a laminated card bearing the seal of New York State, his photo, and his title. The afternoon light made the official seal gleam. Officer Hernandez leaned in to look. His eyes widened. He glanced at Mitchell, then back at Doe. Doe looked at the ID, then at Ramos, then back at the ID. The color drained from his face. There are certain moments in life that crystallize instantly, moments where you know with sickening certainty that you've made a catastrophic mistake. For Sergeant John Doe, this was that moment. He was standing in the home of a New York State Supreme Court justice, in broad daylight, with witnesses, a judge who presided over criminal cases, a judge who understood the law better than anyone in that room, a judge who had just watched him commit a textbook constitutional violation on camera. Because what Doe didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to check before forcing his way inside, was that Ramos had installed a home security system 3 weeks earlier. Cameras at the front door, in the foyer, in the living room, motion activated, high definition, recording everything in perfect afternoon clarity, the forced entry, the refusal to leave, the smirk, the word uncooperative, all of it captured in 1080p clarity with perfect natural lighting. "You need to leave," Ramos said quietly. "All of you, now." Doe opened his mouth, closed it. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something uglier. The desperate calculation of a man trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. "Your Honor," he began, the title sounding foreign in his mouth. You were just violating my Fourth Amendment rights," Ramos interrupted. "You were told this was my home. You were told I did not consent. You were shown my credentials, and you proceeded anyway. I want your names, badge numbers, and the name of your supervisor. Then I want you out." Officer Hernandez stepped forward. "Justice Ramos, I apologize. We'll leave immediately." Doe shot him a glare but said nothing. They filed out in silence, the afternoon sun illuminating their retreat in humiliation. Neighbors watched from their yards, from their windows, as 3 police officers walked back to their vehicles with their heads down. Ramos stood in his doorway and watched them drive away, the flashing lights fading into the peaceful suburban afternoon. Then he closed the door, locked it, and walked upstairs to his study. He sat at his desk, sunlight streaming across the legal pad as he began writing. Not a complaint, a lawsuit. Here's what the department didn't count on. Ramos wasn't just a judge. He was a judge who had spent years reviewing police misconduct cases. He knew the patterns. He knew the playbook. Step 1, downplay the incident. Step 2, claim the officers acted in good faith. Step 3, hope the victim doesn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. But Ramos had both. Within 48 hours of the incident, his attorney, a civil rights specialist named Diane Kowalski, filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all body cam footage, dispatch recordings, and incident reports related to the February 19th welfare check. The department stalled. They claimed technical difficulties, said the footage was under review, suggested it might be unavailable due to equipment malfunction. Kowalski filed a motion to compel. The judge, ironically one of Ramos's colleagues, granted it immediately. 3 weeks later, the footage arrived, and it was damning. The body cam showed everything Ramos had described. The bright afternoons, Doe approaching the door, Ramos calmly identifying himself, Doe pushing inside anyway, the backup officers arriving. The moment Doe's face changed when he saw the judicial credentials all captured in crystal clear daylight footage. But it also showed something else. After Ramos had gone back upstairs, the 3 officers stood outside on the lawn, the afternoon sun beating down on them, their mics still hot. "Did you know who that was?" Hernandez asked. "How the hell was I supposed to know?" Doe snapped. "Maybe when he told you he was a judge." "Yeah, sure, every perp in this city claims they're somebody." "Perp." He'd called a sitting Supreme Court justice a perp. Mitchell chimed in. "Sarge, he had credentials." I don't care if he had a golden ticket, Doe said. Neighbor called it in. Black guy in a white neighborhood. I've seen this before. 9 times out of 10, they're squatting or casing the place. There it was, the assumption laid bare in the middle of the afternoon in a peaceful neighborhood. Not criminal behavior, not evidence, not exigent circumstances, just skin color in the wrong neighborhood. On April 3rd, 2014, Justice Philip Ramos filed a federal civil rights lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 against Sergeant John Doe, Officers Hernandez and Mitchell, and the police department itself. The complaint was 47 pages long. It detailed the unlawful entry, the violation of his Fourth Amendment rights, the racially motivated assumptions, and the department's pattern of racial profiling in predominantly white neighborhoods. It demanded $5 million in damages. It demanded policy reform. It demanded accountability. The local news picked it up immediately. Within 24 hours, it was national. CNN, MSNBC, Fox. Every outlet ran some version of the same headline: Judge's home raided by police in alleged racial profiling incident. The department issued a statement. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and are conducting a thorough internal investigation. Translation: we're circling the wagons. But the body cam footage leaked. Someone inside the department, an officer who'd grown tired of covering for colleagues like Doe, sent the video to a local news station anonymously. Within hours, it was online. Millions of views, shared across social media, dissected frame by frame. The public response was swift and brutal. Protests outside the police headquarters, calls for Doe's termination, demands for the police chief's resignation. The department suspended Doe with pay pending the outcome of the internal investigation. The investigation concluded 6 weeks later. Doe was found to have violated department policy on unlawful search and seizure. He was fired. Hernandez and Mitchell received written reprimands, but Ramos wasn't done. In civil rights cases, depositions are where the truth gets ugly. No cameras, no spectators, just attorneys, a court reporter, and the person being questioned under oath. Sergeant John Doe's deposition took place on September 12, 2014, in a conference room at Kowalski's law firm. For 6 hours, she dismantled him. Kowalski: when Justice Ramos told you he was a judge, did you believe him? Doe: I didn't know. Kowalski: you didn't know or you didn't believe him? Doe: I wasn't sure. Kowalski: had he committed a crime? Doe: no. Kowalski: was there any evidence of a crime in progress? Doe: not that I observed. Kowalski: was there any indication that someone inside the home was in danger? Doe: no. Kowalski: so why did you enter? Doe: I was conducting a welfare check. Kowalski: a welfare check requires consent or exigent circumstances. Did you have either? Doe: I thought. Kowalski: did you have either? Doe: no. The deposition went on, question after question, peeling back the layers of assumption, bias, and arrogance. Kowalski: this incident occurred at 2:34 in the afternoon, correct? Doe: yes. Kowalski: broad daylight? Doe: yes. Kowalski: a peaceful residential neighborhood? Doe: yes. Kowalski: children playing nearby? Doe: I believe so. Kowalski: and you said on the body cam footage, quote, black guy in a white neighborhood, 9 times out of 10 they're squatting or casing the place. Do you stand by that statement? Doe: that was taken out of context. Kowalski: what context makes that statement acceptable? Doe: I didn't mean it like that. Kowalski: how did you mean it? Doe: long pause. I don't know. By the end of the deposition, Doe looked like a man who'd aged a decade. His attorney, provided by the police union, kept objecting, kept trying to steer the questioning, but Kowalski was relentless. She had the facts, she had the footage, she had a client who knew the law better than the officers who'd violated it. The case was unwinnable for the defense. On November 18, 2014, 9 months after the incident, the city settled $850,000 to Justice Ramos, an official public apology from the police chief. mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, a revision of the department's policy on welfare checks requiring supervisory approval before entering a residence without consent. But money and policy changes don't erase what happened. They don't erase the moment a decorated judge stood in his own home on a quiet afternoon and was treated like a criminal. They don't erase the fear that flashed through his mind when 3 officers surrounded him, hands on weapons, in his own living room while the sun shone through his windows. They don't erase the fact that if he hadn't been a judge, if he'd been a mechanic, a teacher, a grocery store clerk, the outcome might have been different or worse. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Ramos had every advantage: education, status, resources, legal expertise, a platform, and he still had to fight for 9 months to get justice. What happens to the people who don't have those advantages? What happens to the black homeowners who can't afford a civil rights attorney? What happens to the families who don't have security cameras, who don't have the knowledge to assert their rights, who don't have the credibility to make people listen? They get trampled, and the officers who trample them get reassigned, retrained, and sent back out into the streets with the same biases, the same assumptions, the same arrogance. The anonymous neighbor who made the call was never publicly identified. But Ramos knew who it was, a woman in her 60s who'd lived on the street for over 30 years. She'd waved at him once when he first moved in, a polite, neighborly gesture. But she'd never knocked on his door to introduce herself, never welcomed him to the neighborhood, never asked his name. She just saw a black man entering a house in broad daylight and assumed he didn't belong. After the lawsuit settled, after the news crews left, after the protests faded, Ramos saw her again. It was a sunny afternoon, much like the one when this all began. She was outside watering her garden. He walked past on his way to his car. She looked up. Their eyes met. She looked away. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence. Ramos got in his car and drove to work, because that's what he does. He shows up, he wears the robe, he presides over cases, he interprets the law for a society that doesn't always see him as fully human. This isn't a story about one bad cop. It's a story about a system that trains officers to see black bodies as threats, even in the absence of any threatening behavior, even in broad daylight, even in peaceful neighborhoods, even when children are playing nearby. It's a story about how implicit bias operates, not through overt hatred, but through assumptions so deeply embedded that they feel like common sense. Black guy in a white neighborhood, 9 times out of 10. That's not policing. That's profiling. And it happens every single day in every corner of this country. The only difference here is that the victim had the power to fight back. But what about the countless others who don't? How many black homeowners have had their doors kicked in during welfare checks? How many have been arrested for trespassing in their own yards? How many have been shot reaching for their wallets because an officer assumed the worst? The data is staggering. A 2019 study by the National Institute of Justice found that Black Americans are 3 times more likely to be subjected to use of force during police encounters than white Americans, even when controlling for behavior and compliance. Another study by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white men over the course of their lifetimes. These aren't isolated incidents, they're patterns, and patterns reveal culture. Here's the question that should haunt every viewer of this story. If Justice Ramos hadn't been a judge, would we even know his name? If he'd been a construction worker, would there have been a lawsuit? If he'd been a high school student, would there have been outrage? Or would it have been filed away as another unfortunate misunderstanding, another case of a nervous officer making a split-second decision, another example of procedure gone awry? Because the culture of assumption doesn't just exist in police departments. It exists in schools, where black students are disproportionately disciplined for the same behaviors that white students get warnings for. It exists in hospitals, where black patients' pain is systematically undertreated because of false beliefs about biological differences. It exists in courtrooms, where black defendants receive harsher sentences than white defendants for identical crimes. It exists in neighborhoods where a black person's presence is seen as suspicious simply because the space is coded as white. Even in the middle of the day, even when they're just living their lives. The sergeant who broke into Ramos's home wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom. Sergeant John Doe never worked in law enforcement again. After his termination, he applied to several police departments in neighboring counties. All rejected him. The body cam footage had made him radioactive. He now works as a security consultant for a private firm. His LinkedIn profile doesn't mention his time as a police officer. Officers Hernandez and Mitchell are still on the force. Both received promotions in the years following the incident. Both completed the mandatory bias training. Both have clean records since. The neighbor still lives on the street. Ramos still lives in the house. He didn't move, didn't sell, didn't let the violation chase him away, because moving would have meant letting them win, and Justice Philip Ramos doesn't lose. So here's what we're left with. A judge, someone with power, knowledge, and resources, was violated in his own home in the middle of a peaceful afternoon because of the color of his skin. He fought back. He won. But what about the people who can't fight back? What about the people who don't know the law, who can't afford attorneys, who don't have security cameras, who don't have the platform to make the world listen? How many times does this happen to them? How many times do officers break into homes, demand compliance, escalate situations based on nothing more than bias and assumption? How many times do we never hear about it? And here's the question that should make you uncomfortable. If you're watching this from the comfort of your home, if you've never had to worry about whether a welfare check might end with your door being kicked in, if you've never had to prove you belong in your own neighborhood, what does that tell you about the world we've built? Who gets to feel safe? And who has to constantly prove their humanity just to survive? This isn't ancient history. This happened in 2014, a decade ago, in broad daylight, in a country that claims to have moved past racism, in a system that claims to protect and serve everyone equally. But we know the truth, don't we? Some people get protection, others get suspicion, and the line between the two isn't drawn by behavior, it's drawn by skin color. If this story made you angry, good, it should. If it made you uncomfortable, even better, because comfort is what allows these systems to persist. Silence is what allows officers like Sergeant Doe to keep their badges for decades before someone finally catches them on camera. Apathy is what allows neighbors to call the police on people whose only crime is existing in a space where they're not expected. So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to scroll past this video and forget about it in an hour? Or are you going to sit with the discomfort and ask yourself what role you play in systems that treat people differently based on how they look? If you've made it this far, drop a comment with your city. Let's build a community of people who refuse to let stories like this disappear. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to see it, because Justice Ramos's story isn't rare. It's just rare that we hear about it. There are thousands of others who didn't have cameras, didn't have credentials, didn't have the resources to fight back. Their stories deserve to be told too, and with your help, we'll make sure they are. Thanks for watching. Now go make some noise.